It's a brand new year, and I'm back refreshed after a little post-main video break. Speaking of which, I hope you all enjoyed Infernal last month, and going off the fact that my sub count has nearly doubled since I launched that video, I can pretty well assume it was positively received. But with the dubiously dubbed Odyssey of Ryan Lennox finally being complete, it's now time for me to move on to the next big main video, and as such, it's time to do another vote. The rules are more or less the same as last time, though I have made some small changes. First off, I'm cutting things down from 8 candidates to 6, just to keep things a bit tighter and more manageable. And secondly, our contending titles now come in 3 different flavors. The first 2 will be fresh games that I am personally suggesting, mostly because I feel like playing them again and I think they could make for fun videos. The next 2 are requests made by you, my fantastic audience here on YouTube, which have been sourced from the various comments received since the last vote. And the last 2 are the second and third place runner-ups from Coming Soon Volume 1, both because those games deserve another bite at the apple, and because it allows me to lazily reuse those chunks of the last video wholesale. Same as before, I'll be giving a little spiel about each game to give you some context on them and an idea as to how I'd approach each one in a video. Once you've picked a favorite, you can then vote by throwing a comment down below. And on that note, ranked votes do count, so feel free to list your second and third choices or even rank the whole list, and I'll track that when I tally things up. It's an extra bit of pain in the ass, but it makes it easier to break any ties and determine runner-ups for Volume 3. Anyways, without further ado, here are the contenders for the next cult classifications. Something that I don't claim to be an expert in, but that I truly enjoy, is classic westerns. Whether it's yodeling along with Gene Autry across his many albums, watching Eastwood chomp on a cheroot with a stare like a knife while Ennio Morricone blares in the background, or seeing Terence Hill devour what looks like the most satisfying plate of beans in the Trinity trilogy, that genre is my happy place. And really, the 70s spaghetti western era of those latter 2 examples is the sweet spot for me, where things are rougher edged and dealt with darker themes than a lot of the hokier cowpuncher flicks from the 1950s, but we're still colorful and willing to show a bit of levity and joy, as opposed to the more morose takes of the genre we see today, which to me often have the color grading of a pair of soiled sweatpants. Hence why Gun is one of my favorite games from the end of the 6th generation, coming out just as the modern era of westerns was starting, but leaning more on those schlocky, almost grindhouse 70s roots. It nailed not only the tone of those sorts of movies, with some fantastically over-the-top characters and writing, but the atmosphere and scale as well, making really strong use of its open world to ensure all the classic western settings were represented, and giving you that wandering gunslinger vibe that is so key to the cowboy power fantasy. It's also a very interesting title when it comes to gaming history, as it was made by Neversoft, during the vanishingly brief moment in time when they were coming out of the Tony Hawk mines, but before they were sent to the Guitar Hero quarry. If you only know them for those 2 franchises, well, Gun really shows just how secretly versatile that studio actually was, and their larger history is absolutely something I want to at least touch on during that video. I think my favorite part of the military shooter boom of the 7th gen was, funnily enough, right when it was ending. That's because you got all sorts of really weird takes on the formula at that time, as the big publishers were trying to freshen things up to keep shooter fatigue at bay. Call of Duty went futuristic during this time, with Ghosts and Advanced Warfare. And while Respawn's Titanfall was EA trying to go down the same road, they hedged their bets by taking Battlefield down a much different path. Of course, there was Battlefield 1, which was them looking so far back as to bypass their World War II roots entirely and instead depict a debatably accurate struggle against the Kaiser. But before that was their maligned attempt to spin the series into a cop procedural with Battlefield Hardline. And I remember a lot of people scoffing at the idea back then, but it made a lot of sense to me, because Cops and Robbers is about as classic of a concept as it gets, and it's an easy swap for the Spec Ops versus nondescript Middle Eastern terrorist cells or comically evil Russians dynamic that people were getting so sick of. You could even call it somewhat ahead of its time, because while Hardline is probably the least liked game in the Battlefield franchise, other games have run with that idea really successfully since, specifically Rainbow Six Siege, after it got its shit together, and more recently Ready or Not. While Hardline was a flop at the time for a variety of reasons and still has a bad rep, I remember playing through the campaign at the time and really enjoying it as it hit all the schlocky 80s cop show beats that I wanted. We wouldn't really be digging into the multiplayer, of course, that's not really my bag and the community for it isn't exactly thriving, but I'd love the chance to go back through the single player again and see if there's a weekend rental gem hiding there, otherwise spurned by the general gaming public. Mentioned ever so briefly in my Homefront the Revolution video as I was going over Free Radical / Dambusters history, Second Sight is an unassuming little title put out by that same developer and released smack in the middle of their spree of far more successful Time Splitters games. Going for a darker tone than their prior titles, Second Sight's story is focused on parapsychology and divergent timelines, for lack of a better term, and to try not to spoil anything, with even the box art comparatively putting off a very different vibe to that of Time Splitters. To complement that, it also strayed away from the more run-and-gun antics of the dev's flagship franchise in favor of a greater focus on stealth, puzzles, and of course psychic powers. Spooky elements aside, it actually sounds closer to a lot of the later work the dev would do on Haze, Crisis, and of course Homefront the Revolution than the more arcadey Time Splitter stuff people were used to seeing from them at the time. As for why it never managed to gain wider acclaim, it's hard to say. Its lead platform was the GameCube as I recall, which wasn't exactly the destination for shooter fans at the time, so that probably didn't help, though it did also release on the PS2, Xbox, and eventually PC. It was also published by Codemasters, which, if you've seen my Damnation video, you know had a shaky catalog as a publisher, especially back in the aughts. Funnily enough, looking over the Steam DB listings for Second Sight, it seems it was actually a pre-order bonus for the PC version of Damnation, so that's a fun connection. Personally, while I am familiar with it and remember seeing it on shelves back in the day, I never actually played it, at least that I can remember, and I'd be very curious to dive in and see what it's like. And thanks to one of you asking for it, now I just might. Oh, I was wondering when I would eventually have to play a David Cage game for this channel. I have been dreading the day when I would have to descend into the very French depths of pretentious insanity that his works encompass. That said, if I'm going to cover any one of his titles, it might as well be Indigo Prophecy, better known as Fahrenheit outside of North America, as it's right at the point in his career, and in gaming technology as a whole, where his whole deal actually makes sense. It's past the early and horrifically clunky days of Omicron the Nomad Soul, but before the PS3 burned down the forest in the middle of the Uncanny Valley and blew all the resulting smoke up his ass with heavy rain and his further works past that. It still carries all of his hallmarks, of course: bizarre, awkward controls and gameplay ideas, clumsily juggled yet lofty story concepts, uncomfortable sex scenes. It's got the whole package. But it is more reined in, as it was published by Atari. He didn't have that Sony money quite yet, and it's somewhat less pretentious than his later games. The 6th gen was also just a really good time for weirder titles like this to break through the noise and make a mark, and it's why it did well enough to gain critical acclaim and really give him and his studio Quantic Dream the long-lasting legacy they've had since. It's a legacy I'll certainly cover to some degree as well, but I think this video will be more about seeing if Indigo Prophecy still holds up in the modern day as an actual video game. While I've seen plenty of it over the years, it's prime fodder for any number of Let's Play channels for a reason, I've never actually sat down and played it for myself, so this will be the chance to see if it's really as bad and as good as people say. There are few things quite as painful in gaming as a never was, and the one that still hurts the most for me is that we never ended up getting the XCOM revival that was originally planned. A first-person shooter developed by the teams who worked on BioShock 2 and set during the 1950s, this was intended to be a more macabre take on an alien invasion, playing off the tropes of the era and telling the origins of the XCOM agency as we came to know it in the 1990s. This version of the game was far enough along to have been previewed to press at various events, and reading those previews back in the day, I was hyped. Sadly, old XCOM fans were not, as they were up in arms over the genre and tone change from the originals, leading to the creation of the 2012 Firaxis-led XCOM remake/reboot that we all know and love. Originally, we were supposed to still get that initially revealed FPS prequel title as well, but after XCOM 2012 blew up the way it did, the FPS was shelved, ripped to shreds, and retooled into the shambling shadow of a game that is the Bureau XCOM Declassified, a more tonally in line third-person shooter with a Mass Effect-style team and tactics system. While it's ostensibly a better fate than being fully cancelled, I still felt personally slighted by it at the time, and much as I'm glad we saw the proper XCOM revival that we did, I'll always wish we could have seen the original version for this game fully developed. I plan to break down the game we got while trying not to be too salty about the past and genuinely taking a fair look at it with fresh eyes, before then doing a deep dive into the extremely limited info available on that initial version and what could have been, but never was. Remember when Ubisoft used to make fun, weird, single-player experiences that weren't bogged down with microtransactions? When they contained more than sanded-down, cookie-cutter gameplay mechanics that at best felt like Pablo? Well, I do. I won't go too deep down the shitting on Ubisoft well, there's plenty of other people who've done that before me and better than I ever could, shout out to Ross and his Stop Killing Games effort on that note, but it is important to remember why that collective pain exists. It's because Ubisoft used to occasionally make some really cool shit. Driver San Francisco is a perfect example of said cool shit. A story-based racing game with a central mechanic where you body swap into different cars at speed to strategically cause traumatic 10-car pileups. Making it even more novel is that you do all of this within the story trappings of a California 70s cop procedural, though the game is set in the aughts. It's Quantum Leap meets Starsky and Hutch meets Need for Speed meets a demolition derby. It is the rare game where you can genuinely say there is nothing else like it. Sadly, that lightning is likely never being bottled again either, because while it did well critically, it didn't make sales anywhere close to Ubisoft's more mainstream franchises. If you're looking for a review where I shit all over a game, this won't be it. Because while I'm sure it'll be an absolute ball ache to get the PC version running in this day and age, I love this game at launch, and honestly, I've just been looking for an excuse to play it again. Also, aside from some context setting on modern Ubisoft, this likely will be a video that sticks pretty much entirely to the game and doesn't dive too much into side material. Unless I happen to dig up an interesting story that has more nuance to it than just Ubisoft bad. And that's the lot. Go pick your favorites and leave those comments down below. After 2 weeks, on January 31st to be specific, I'll announce the winner over on the channel community tab, as well as in the comments on this video, before getting down to work. Before you click away though, I do have some channel housekeeping to talk about if you're curious, covering what's going on around here outside of just the next big main video. First off, I just want to express how grateful I am to you all for watching, and say how much seeing the channel grow like this means to me. The last time I did one of these votes, it was because the video I had just made at the time, Inversion, had somewhat flopped upon launch, and I was feeling a bit rudderless, still sitting at just over 100 subs or so after several years of videos. I wasn't really sure if people actually cared to watch what I was making, and by offering a choice, I was hoping to try to spur things on. What a difference a few months can make. The channel is now growing at a rate I never expected, and I see so many of you in the comments with so many nice things to say, and clearly really enjoying all the hard work I've put in, which really does just mean the world to me. With so many more of you watching now, though, that does create some expectations, so I did want to address some of that, specifically talking about engaging with the channel outside of these videos. There was a conversation in the Infernal comments about me setting up a Discord, and yeah, that's not gonna happen. I'm not really social at the best of times, and it just doesn't jive well with how I want to approach things, not to mention that having a Discord server these days just seems like asking for trouble. For now, if you want to suggest games for me to cover, just stick to leaving those in the comments on really any of my videos, as I do read every comment I get, and I always try to respond where it makes sense. If you do need to get a hold of me privately for whatever reason, that's what the email in the channel bio is for, so fill your boots. Something else that has come up repeatedly in the comments recently is setting up a Patreon or a Ko-Fi or some sort of supporter thing, and that is something I will be doing, as it would be nice to subsidize the cost of making these videos somewhat, but I'm still figuring out exactly how. To be honest, it's something I've been mulling over for a while anyways, but I just don't know exactly what it would look like yet in terms of pricing, or tiers, or benefits, or any of that. Regardless of what I end up putting together there though, I can promise that I won't be putting any of the current sorts of videos that I make behind that paywall. The main cult classifications videos and the smaller stuff like cult recommendations and the It Came From series will remain free and unmonetized. If you do see ads on those, that's YouTube scraping them for copyright pennies. And speaking of those smaller videos, while I'm going to try to cut down on the amount of time between this vote ending and the resulting video coming out, I'm still going to try and get another small video out beforehand as well, just as a palate cleanser. It'll likely be another It Came From, both because the last one did so well, and because I've been saving something that I hope you'll really like. Anyways, thanks for watching, thanks for voting, and have a good one.